My name is Bettina Kames. I am the director of Light Art Space, the art foundation that commissioned the exhibition Berl-Berl by Jakob Kudsk Steensen. LIS bridges art, the latest technologies, and science. With new exhibition formats and experimental projects, we aim to make the present tangible and the future visible. Our thinking and activities are centered around the future as an opportunity and as a challenge. We want to entangle the art world with artificial intelligence, quantum computing, outer space, gaming, and so much more. We are therefore particularly delighted to be part of the Berlin Science Week, again this year, as it corresponds with the core of LIS interdisciplinary approach. Last year, we presented a talk by artist Libihini about quantum computing and the challenges it holds for the future of making art. This year, we are presenting Jakob Kudsk Steensen. Our curiosity for the unconventional leads us to pioneering emerging artists that bring new matters and formats into the art sphere. Jakob is one of these pioneering artists. His work, Berl-Berl, commissioned by LIS, is about Berlin's history as a wetland and the mythologies associated with it. For the realization of the work, Jakob spent several months researching the surviving marshes of the Berlin-Brandenburg region, in particular the Spreewald. Using the Unreal computer game engine, he generated a virtual 3D world from this archive, in which relics of the Ice Age meet today's wetlands. The Museum for Naturkunde Berlin proved to be an amazing, valuable partner for the project. The artist was given access to the archives and had sound recordings and digitized objects from fauna and flora merged into his work. In addition to this, the museum developed a wide-ranging education program in cooperation with LIS, especially for the exhibition, and which enchanted thousands of children with the so important but endangered ecosystem of the swamp. I'm more than pleased to welcome the artist Jakob Kudsk Steensen, curator Emma Enderby, and scientist Dr Kim Mortega, who will take us on a journey to the origins of Berlin 10,000 years ago and back into the future.
Hello. Hi. Welcome everyone to the Museum for Naturkunde and today's talk, which brings together artist Jakob Kudsk Steensen, scientist Dr Kim Mortega. By way of my introduction, I'm Emma Enderby, the curator of Jakob's exhibition Berl-Berl, which was commissioned by LIS, Light Art Space, and installed at Berghain this summer, and I'll be your moderator for this evening's talk. It is my great pleasure to introduce my fellow panelists. Danish artist Jakob Kudsk Steensen works with environmental storytelling through 3D animation, sound, and immersive installation. He creates poetic interpretations about overlooked natural phenomena through collaborations with field biologists, composers, and writers. His projects are based on extensive fieldwork, several months long in duration. He was the inaugural recipient of the Serpentine Gallery's Augmented Architecture Commission, which was established with Google Arts in 2019, was shortlisted for the Future Generation Art Prize in 2019, both in Kiev and the 58th Venice Biennale. He's exhibited extensively globally in museums, at biennials, film festivals. Dr. Kim Mortega is a scientist at the Museum for Naturkunde, Leipzig Institute for Evolution and Biodiversity Research. Her own research and teaching interests conservation, biodiversity, ecology, with a special interest in birds. She regularly teaches field courses in tropical ecology and conservation for the Tropical Biology Association in Africa. And Kim received her doctorate in genetics in the evolution of songbirds at the University of Constance and the Max Planck Institute for Ornithology. So as Bettina Kames, the director of LAS, explained in her video introduction, the work created by Jakob Berl-Berl really took the swamp as its protagonist. And we're going to be discussing today that collaboration with the Museum for Naturkunde became such kind of an important part in the making and the realization of this work. But before we begin the conversation, I invite you all to watch a short video that explores the making of Berl-Berl. So that was just a snapshot of its installation at Berghain. And as we talk, there will be images that show more installation images, as well as really the process of making the work. But to begin, I actually wanted to start at the beginning to think about each of your paths. Really, what brought you, Jakob, to be an artist, and you, Kim, to be a scientist? Jakob?
Yeah, so I mean, I grew up in the countryside of Denmark for a long part of my life as a kid, and grew up with a family that were a lot outside and scientists. So we would go, collect species in like little ponds, identify them, and learn about them. But at the same time, I also grew up more and more with kind of the explosion of the internet, and especially like very complicated 3D worlds through video games. So very early on, I had this combination of living in a very small town of 500 people near the coast and having access to these like expansive world building through these video game tools, and also the internet, where I could upload different landscapes and worlds and communicate with other people who were doing the same. So just from a very early age, for like 13, 15, and like growing up, it just became more and more a combination of my studies, like what I do professionally, what I work with as an artist, and something I felt was becoming more and more commonplace. So the way we live, the way we both connect through digital media, but also to actual environments, and think about a sense of displacement and connection between them. And then in my studies, I studied really this quite erratic combination of art history, fine arts, anthropology for a year. And I think the way I've kind of collaborate and create now is by following a very like erratic movement. So I never really know what happens in the end when I start. So for me, it's like a very personal journey, even though it also is connected to big scientific disciplines or large technologies. I always try to embed it, infuse it with like something very personal, which comes from this just like kind of just a very bodily experience of a place. Yeah.
Beautiful. And Kim?
Yeah, actually, even if we haven't talked about it before, I grew up in the countryside, sort of it, along the Baltic Sea. There were just nature was around me, and I really was immersed into nature every day. So I spent all my days in the woods along the sea, and also watch and look at birds and other animals, and really explore nature. For me, the moment where I really said, oh, well, I want to become a scientist, was actually when I learned scuba diving on the Philippines when I was a teenager, because I was amazed by coral reefs. They were colorful, and an explosion of animals and plants. And I remember the time when my teacher said, "Oh, to me, this looks all dead." And I was like, oh my goodness. And already as a teenager, I decided then I would love to become a scientist protecting nature, at least coral reefs. It came quite close with wetlands now. But I really love to do or want to do what I love and have passion for. And that's how I ended up at the museum, surrounded by artists and impressive people who have the same thinking.
But I'm just curious, though, specifically, how did you get to working with the songs of birds as well?
Also starting right at home when I was a child, actually, because we had pigeons a lot, so I spent hours inside this hut whenever I loved to listen to. And I'm not the girl who spent lots of have a big knowledge about each species. This came later, actually, during studies when I was a student and hand-raised nightingales and explored and researched on their song learning. And I was amazed by the part that there are so many similarities between humans learning language and songbirds learning their song. It's really a cultural heritage, and I was fascinated by that now already almost 20 years.
Well, that really relates to Berl-Berl as well, in the way that you use sound in that, which we can discuss a little bit. But I think, Jakob, obviously the collaboration with Kim here was so fundamental to Berl-Berl, but you've collaborated with natural history museums before and with other individual scientists. Can you talk a little bit about how this has entered your work previously and why this type of collaboration is so important to you as an artist?
Yeah, it's actually funny. We share a few things. I went to the Philippines to go diving, and it made the switch for me going from like kind of academia. I thought like, okay, I couldn't really get into art school, so I kind of went into university, and I went to the Philippines to go diving, and I switched and just decided to pursue art as well after making friends with a guy I knew from South Africa that I started a diving company. But with the songs and the natural history, I did a project a few years ago called Reanimated that started a deeper collaboration for me with natural history institutions, because I did a project based on the song of the Kauai-o. So it's a bird that's extinct, but that has recordings of it. So you can kind of listen to species that are lost, almost as like ghosts that persist in our environment through the way that we archive. So through the archives, we can kind of access the past, even though it's no longer there, and we can tell stories about it. So for me, it really started to solidify working with the Natural History Museum in New York. In 2018, I started to work with them. And it took me like 3 months to get access to this one drawer that I could open, and then photograph these birds that were collected in the 1800s. And then it took me like another month to get access to the song of the bird. And then finally, I found the guy who recorded the bird, and I interviewed him about his memory of it. And it really struck me that there was this weird relationships between this big institution that collects all this material and the data and the species, and how safeguarded it has been through history. Like what's exciting here in Berlin is that it's more open to work with the museum, but tradition is like very safeguarded. And then this guy who's telling me very emotionally, and like his voice is almost breaking because it's so emotional to him, that like he spent 40 years of his life studying this bird, and he's going through the memory of the last time he saw it when it was alive, or like they went out, and he tells me that they knew they were becoming rare, but they could not imagine that it would actually become extinct. It was like an abstract concept for him, even though there was so much science behind it. So I started to really kind of explore these relationships between very personal engagements with this archival material and the structure of the institution, and how you kind of enter it or find something very specific and then zoom it back out. So I've been doing this in New York with this virtual reality project called Reanimated, and then also in London with the Natural History Museum for like an AR work in the park, in Hyde Park in London, where I work with like archival recordings of different species there. and different specimens that I then, so to make my work, I would go in and like digitize the feathers or like the eye of a bat, and then works with the sound and kind of connect this materiality, and then offer that as like an immersive experience through the park in London, as like an AR project. And then the project here with Berl-Berl, which is like a more expansive manifestation of this interest, where, yeah, it's just been really interesting kind of entering an archive and navigating it both for you and scientists, and go between like fact and science and just weird personal anecdotes from people about different species in the archive.
I mean, just to talk a little bit about the archive, Kim, so it's really under the general director, Professor Vogel, that the Museum for Naturkunde has not only collected but digitized, I mean, hundreds of thousands of species. Can you talk a little bit about this collection? You know, what is the process for digitizing? Why is that kind of important for a museum to be doing?
So first of all, in this museum where we are right now, there are 30 million objects. They're all going to be digitized in the next years. So we just had an opening, actually, digitize a new technology street, digitizing 5,000 individuals, insects per day. So that's quite astonishing. So by March, in the next few months, we will have collected and digitized 500,000 of our collection of insects by then, and then moving forward with the other, I think, left 15 million, I think we have, of insects. And then what we offer as well is open science. That means everyone in this world can access these data anytime, with any purpose, artists and scientists, or just lay people, anyone who is interested to use or just have a look at our data are welcome. It's what I love about the fact that we are an open museum, or trying to become better as an open museum. And with that also, there is this future plan that every object, also birds or songs and so on, which are already open to the public, can be publicized.
Yes, you have an incredible sound archive as well here at the museum. And it's what entered Berl-Berl, which, you know, as we've mentioned, really centers the wetlands that surround Berlin. And it's really the wetlands that ultimately brought you together. And I know you're both extremely knowledgeable about the history of the swamps here in Berlin. And could you speak a little bit about that history, where Berl came from? Maybe Kim, start with you.
So actually, swamps and moors here are very in decline. So Berlin has now, and it sounds a bit of a lot, 76 sites of wetlands, which we could have explored together. You have done a lot, I know, and but they're very small. It's just a tiny fragment of what it's left. And it used to be a real swampy area because of the glacial valley where all the water came together. And if you think about why it's so valuable, it is because moors and swamps, they have 95% of water storage. They preserve and store carbon even more than in forests. They are, for us in Berlin here, for example, a source where you can actually explore nature, which is quite uncommon in urban areas. Berlin, we are even a bit lucky that we are still have areas which we should protect. And there are an enormous biodiversity. So the protection and love for nature, that's why I think Berl, as the Sorbic isn't it? I think it's your part. You're gonna talk about more about the myths and so on. Come together. So first there was Köln and Berlin, just little villages where actually the settlement started, and they all have their stories about and history about swamps. So when I work along the last year, I encountered so many people who would love to tell me their story, their history, their connection with swamps, which I really loved. And I think this connection with art, biology, nature, and including the social aspects and anecdotes are quite nice.
Yeah, and what drew you, Jakob, then to make a work about the swamp and specifically here?
Yeah, so in past works, I worked more like the very iconic stories of climate change, like a sinking tropical island, a bird that's extinct. These like things that influence all of us, but that for at least like where we are right now might feel far away. So during the like lockdown and everything, I started to think about worlds right in front of us that we don't think about so much. And the wetland is one of them. Like in the research, I also found that basically any large civilization in the world, unless it's a nomadic culture, is founded by a wetland. So it's this like universal connection to survival and freshwater that everybody needs, but that we've kind of forgotten about, because a lot of the stories about the wetlands, and literally most of them have been removed since the 1700 and like paved over or just kind of turned into farmland because the perspective of the environment has changed. So with Berl-Berl, we would start to think about, okay, how can I bring back something, not just like one specific memory or one specific, let's say, bird, but a type of perspective or sensibility. So I started looking into these old Slavic myths of the wetland, and there are a lot of especially Sorbian ones surrounding Berlin. So before there was like modern German language, or even before the Middle Ages, there were multiple different languages and cultures in this whole region that had a lot of songs and mythologies and words to describe the landscape. But as the landscape transforms, language transforms. So I started really to kind of pair this expertise knowledge from Kim and the Natural History Institution with like language, concepts, songs, and sensibilities from the past, and start to think about how to merge them. Because the one thing that I also think like like a museum that's digitizing millions of species is sort of like that becomes data or like fact. But as humans, I think we need to connect to things like through color, through rhythm, through emotion, through memory. This is like an embodied experience. You have to move through something, a material, in order to internalize it, and then it kind of becomes part of your thinking. So I started to look into all these songs and work with researchers on the wetlands and the songs, and that became like a foundation for how the species from the collection, so how the soil that I've been out digitizing and the trees, how are they represented? What do they feel like? What do they, kind of say and sing? Like Berl-Berl is basically an instrument. It's this whole technology that can turn a building into this dynamic instrument in virtual environment. So it's kind of always evolving and moves around you. So I really start to kind of think about, okay, well, the way that these wetlands are going to be portrayed in Berl-Berl are going to be inspired by folklore and myths and songs as a way of like bringing back a different perspective on what you're looking at. So it's the first time that I've both worked with natural history, but also thinking about something more abstract, which is like your perspective on a thing, or the way you sensorially like relate to it, which is like it's like how do you bring back a collective sensibility, which is really an abstract thing, but also through another form of archive, which is the language, the songs, we can actually also do this as humans. We can kind of connect to the past in different places through the science, but also through the folklore. And this is something we can do as humans that I think is important that we conserve and pay attention to, and bring back like a fascination for wetlands that is just right in front of us, but you rarely think about.
And it's where the title of the work also came from your research, right?
Yeah. So Berl means swamp in Slavic, and there are a lot of theories and things pointing to that in like the 1100, it was referred to as Berl, which was where Berlin was built to build a bridge across the wetland for a trade route. This is like an old folk was referred to as the Wendisch. They moved across Europe, and they needed to cross this delta right here. Not a delta, like the kind of the river and the Franke that runs through the area. They needed to cross this, and so they built. The word for there was Berl, which meant swamp, and then the city started to evolve. So that's how Berlin as a city evolved 1,000 years ago. It's actually as a bridge to cross the wetland. And a lot of the streets in the cities are Old Slavic words for rivers, for different water types and things. So you find this through Berlin still. And this became kind of like an archive for the work also. That became a big part of what it feels like when you enter this, the artwork itself.
You were just speaking a lot about the sound, which was a really fundamental element of the installation and the experience of the work. It, wove together the sounds from the archive, but as well you collaborated with Arca, as you refer to, kind of thinking about the myths and the songs. Can you kind of talk through that soundscape and also how it kind of was positioned within the world of Berl-Berl?
Yeah, so just as a bit of context for that, the way that all the visuals in the work are made is through this process of digitizing all these individual elements. But it's the same with like the sound. So when I started working with the sound of the extinct bird, I started to think about, we can sense things that are lost through this preservation. So with Berl-Berl, I wanted to mix the timescale more. So we went out and recorded sounds in the wetlands for a month in March, and then mix those together with recordings as far back as we can go to like the 60s, and then you literally are hearing sounds, from the present, from different wetlands around Berlin, as well as the past, and different species like frogs, bats, there are birds. There's like all these different species in there. So it's kind of like literally mixing together imprints through time, because like a body was in that landscape recording that bird in like the 70s. And that device is, taking an imprint of that vibration of the sound into a device that is now accessible to us, and you can mix that with something you record now. So these vibrations are kind of literally meeting each other. So Berl-Berl has this oscillation and change of time where sometimes it feels like it's very calm, or like it belongs to the past, and sometimes the work feels very kind of like almost like this crazy psychedelic science fiction where everything is like mixing together in ways that we can only do now. And again, that's like both inspired by the science. So it's like when you talk to a soil scientist here, they tell you that the soil is alive and it can have organic material in it from like thousands of years ago that's not fully decomposed. So this is in the soil. And then in the folklore, you find a lot of songs and narratives about how there's life in the soil and how the soil can connect you to your world, to the life of the dead and the living. So it's kind of like there are different people talking about similar things, both in like mythology or in science, or as an artist now. My chair's turning. So it became about like mixing these things together very literally and creating a system that can do this. And so there's this living sound system that in Berghain, it's kind of like you have this big global space. So there are sounds that sort of like rain that we recorded, or rain that was recorded there like in the 70s. And they take up kind of the atmosphere of the space. Then you have little songs of like 20 meters in area that plays more regionalized songs. So if you see a tree on the screen, you kind of hear bark of that specific tree kind of close to you. And then you have these little niche places throughout the space that has very textural sounds. And again, it's like the archival material and what we recorded. But with the archival material and the sounds, it was kind of, there's like a bit of science. Like we had a lot of conversation with many scientists. And at first, when I meet a scientist, like, what do you want to know? What do you want to have access to? But my kind of what I'm looking for is more like someone telling me, like Kim in the end reveals her favorite bird in the wetland, and she sends me a photo of it, and that just becomes like a massive feather in the work, So it's like I try to, and we did the same with like frogs and birds. We look for things. It's kind of like navigating this enormous archive through encounters with scientists that know material scientifically, but I try to look for things that, in the end, is more personal, and that becomes our decision for what enters the work. Because otherwise, you have like infinite possibilities. It's a wetland. There's so much biodiversity. You can't like virtually recreate all that. It's impossible. So it's sort of like, mixing.
Yeah.
What I like to add, just because as a scientist, the idea that you store all these sounds in soil and so on over decades, the fact that, for example, peat, so decomposed plants and so on, the layer to build up is, so one layer of 1 millimeter needs a year to build up. So I love the idea that you have like decomposed anecdotes and sounds saved and stored, and then Matt McCockle and you just go there and collect the sounds again and revise it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you touched on my next question that, the collaboration between you two was kind of twofold. There were the research trips, like you're seeing on the screens, out in the field where you were documenting, but also the sharing of the archive here for Jakob to explore, to also bring into Berl-Berl. I mean, Kim, considering just it's such a vast archive, how did you think about what to show Jakob?
You revealed it a bit, and it was my interest as well. So I love to work here at the museum because I love to explore all these archives, which I don't know everything. So we were talking, and I had some interest about and very looking at what kind of swarm addition, correlations, and so on. People I just met or thought about, scientists who have their stories, and so we invited them and talked and had discussions. And for me, this collaboration is really also a steep learning curve as well. Learning about butterflies, learning about fish and frogs and all these other amphibians and reptiles, and go into the archive. Was for me a real treasure. Listening to the others, for me, certainly I went to the ornithology, so the bird collection as well. It was very important for me because I have built up quite some stories, science, and anecdotes about here, but also what I did do for research in the last 20 years. And I think it really came into the point it was going along and exchange and meeting different people. Your interest was then botany. I was like, oh, botany. I'm not even sure if we have a botanist here at the museum, but there's one. And I learned about that too. So there are you open actually doors for me as well. So
It's kind of like rapid poking. It's like you need, because when you enter a place like this as an artist, it's like, I don't possess any, you meet people who spent decades researching one thing. So they know it through the science, but they actually also know it like through their fingers or like through their memory, or you probably have a lot of memories of bird songs, and it's like, that's kind of, that's that one scientific, but it's also kind of rhythmic and sensoric. You might, I don't know, but maybe one of them like, that's really cool. You move with it or something, and you start noticing these human patterns as a way of relating to the material. So it's not like when you enter a place like that as an artist, the first thing is always like, what do you want to know? I have 10,000 beetles. You're like, okay, it's a wetland, so show me some wetland beetles. And you kind of like have to start somewhere, but you're kind of fishing for something to open up at some point that breaks the wall, or that suddenly like clicks or brings something resonating that can be hard to describe also. And I think that's when it becomes interesting, like as an artwork, because it can really activate you. It can bring like a power to people or something, and you can translate that. And also like the way to collaborate. There's this sound artist, Matt McCockle, someone like Lou O'Neill, Aka, the singer, and the scientist, and me. So there are many different people. They have their different input and ideas of what is Berl-Berl, what is it sort of. And then you mix it all together, which is kind of the beauty of these virtual worlds, which is that you can harmonize different perspectives. You can put the songs, different perspectives, different ideas, and you can weave them together so it feels like this rhythmic, holistic entity, even though it is actually different recordings through time, different forms of inputs, different ideas about what the artwork is. And it's kind of like you put it together a little bit sneaky, because everyone has a strong idea what it is, but in the end it's something third. It's like a non-individual thing, you know. So it's kind of like setting up this ecosystem that different things enter. Yeah.
I mean, sorry, no.
One thing I'd love to add is that you even inspired MFN, so museum scientists, who then, while being at the collection with you, so they don't know each corner, and learn about their own water moth specimens, and then go into the field this year and really collect data and got a new interest, research interest and questions. So I was really amazed by that, actually.
Yeah, there was this like white water moth that kind of, we were looking through the collection, and then this guy showed us these like white moths that are becoming extinct in the area, and he was like, "Oh, we have a lot of these." I was like, just these like a lot of these frames, and it became such a like weird thing, or like an encounter where it's like, "Oh, you have a lot of these specimens of this thing that's almost not out there anymore," and it's like I don't know, something like is interesting there. Yeah.
It's why the world should meet, right? But the collaboration also between LAS and the Museum for Naturkunde resulted in a programmatic educational and citizen science initiative, which really you spearheaded, Kim, called Wissensfluss der Berliner Panke. You know, how were you in developing that influenced by Jakob's work? And also if you could just talk about the program as well.
So one thing that really inspired me is that Jakob put together like the past and intermingled with the present and look into the future. So I actually, the first idea was to, you took all these myths and the past and putting it together, and with the Wissensfluss project, so knowledge flow in English, we are focusing on the renaturation of a river. And there, as I told you already, there's lots of stories behind it. But at the moment, there's also a process of the panke, which has called the stinke panke, so it's the stinky panke, because due to anthropogenic disturbances such as straightening it, using as a sewage, having lots of tanneries there, like just 150 years ago, it's changed completely. And we were thinking about inviting schools and the public to get a view how the past was intermingled with the art and myths and histories, putting it together. How does it actually look nowadays? And it's still a stinky panke. And it is a treasure that we have it in our hands, that we can change that still. So with schools, we really want to engage students to learn about their still precious environment, and that they can actually renaturate, restore nature in their neighborhood, really inside or in a city such as Berlin. And this was the beginning and how I got inspired, or we. Certainly there's also the fact that the panke just flows along my office here at the museum, which took like, we were like a source where, oh, we can start right from here. This used to be swamps. Now let's see how it's changed and how we can change this, how it was actually before, when no human being has degraded it.
Yeah, I just want to add quick. I think also this is a great way of collaborating, which I really enjoyed both with LAS and the Natural History Museum, where you align different forms of, you know, interest and expertise, and they kind of communicate together, but they also do the individual elements strong, so that it's like there's an artwork that's taking that as far as it can, and a museum like creating a whole educational program around it. It's really like you enforce the strength of two, rather than trying to like merge a mix that's a little bit forced maybe sometimes. In this, I mean, like an art and science context, you can. That's kind of like a thing that can happen. Where I've found that was really unique to do.
Yeah, no, and you know, part of the work that you do, and you touched on it just now, is this kind of concept of rewilding or renaturation. Can you explain what this is and how your work, how you've been achieving this and working towards this in the Pankow region?
So first I have to admit that the Senate of Berlin really started with the renaturation of, I give the example with the Panke now, which means that, I have to look it up, the European Water Framework Directive, that's how it's called in English, which really is to put back into perspective that the rivers of Europe should be restored by 2015, now 27, and have an ecological value and be naturalized again. So this is what is planned since 2006. What happened then is that there are lots of administrative things, but now the Berlin Senate actually in the next years will renaturate the Pankow. What does that mean? So now it is straightened, full of sewage and other pollutants. It is very degraded and has a low number of biodiversity. And this can be changed if you, for example, let the river meander again. So, for example, what will happen, it will flow quick, it will flow at other parts very slow, so that actual, like fish schools and so on, can be present again and develop. Other macrozoobenthus, other living water animals will return. This in turn will, gather insects and other birds around the river. And we at the school, citizen science, would love to monitor the change, the hopeful change for a higher biodiversity in the next years. So I'm planning love to evaluate the next 20 years along the Pankow, where schools honestly can be there and be the Pankow explorers, the guardians of the Pankow. And we do have some schools really interested to put it into their school curriculum.
I mean, this also relates to concepts that you've explored, Jakob, in your work, specifically around what you've termed virtual rewilding. Could you just talk through that?
Yeah, so it's like when I create a project, that's based on a scientific fact or landscape or something, that's like a fact, that's a narrative. So here it's like, okay, we need to create more rivers and kind of have natural flow and rewild the landscape so it has a higher biodiversity. And as someone who has also worked in a virtual realm for a long time, the way we perceive and experience a lot of things on phones and computers, Netflix, like whatever, is becoming more and more standardized, and there's very little kind of erratic behavior. There's very little like intuition at play. There's very little unpredictability. So it's sort of like, I also, when I create a project like this, I work heavily digitally, but to create it digitally, there's no master design. So what happens virtually happens first by just scouting through the landscapes, and things slowly enter the digital domain, which is opposite of how really most things virtual is made today, which is you have a concept, you write it down, you design it, you outsource it, and it returns to you. And then this is what people experience. So we're kind of creating a whole culture, the way we relate, communicate to each other or through media, through, from concepts, mind, creation. And this is reflected back at us. So we become, conflict, mind, creation. So we're just obsessed with like language and design and like this kind of rhythm. So by working in Wetlands, which is this domain where you can move in any direction, you can go left, right, up, down, and back and forth. Sort of, you can like keep going in the same mud like this. The material in the end, in an artwork like that, will embrace that. So it's kind of unpredictable. It's in a digital domain. It's pretty wild. It's pretty like, from like a production perspective, it's pretty crazy to work that way because it's very like demanding and you need high expertise. So it's kind of weird if you ask like someone working on film or something to work that way, because it's almost impossible, So that's what I mean by like a virtual rewilding. It's like pairing those two. So it's like this actual wilding the landscape, but also wilding kind of how we are just creating and experiencing through devices, which is so omnipresent for most of us, you know. It's a big part of how we think and feel the world, but it's so master designed. So infusing these different rivers is kind of the analogy, you know. So like the work with the extinct bird is about the memory of an extinct bird and listening to it, extinction, but it's also just accepting that things die in the digital age. So it has a dual narrative. So every project I do has that duality to it. Yeah.
But I mean, we've also talked about how then you can bring back to life, right, extinct creatures in the virtual space. And there is something that can be seen in one hand as quite dystopian about that you experience these kind of lost worlds through more a virtual space, but then also something with what the work that you're trying to do is to actually connect back again into the landscape to think about, you know, what you've been talking about, Kim, in your work and what you do in terms of rewilding the local area.
Yeah, I think you can never replace what's lost. Like kind of de-extinction is not something I kind of believe in a way. I think it's like it's something we do as a culture, like bringing back things that are lost. But when you do it, you go through a process of transformation. So like if you bring back a mammoth, it's not going to be a mammoth. It's going to be this hybrid thing that we perceive as that animal. So it's kind of the story and the emotion. And that's why I think it's like with the rewilding, like taking things that are near extinct or extinct in the virtual domain, it kind of triggers your memory, you know, your language, the way you think about it and connect through time. But it can never replace the biodiversity in the landscape. So that's kind of like how I think about it. Yeah.
I mean, a lot of your work, Jakob, does consider our climate emergency. You know, this work specifically relates not only to Berlin, but the loss of wetlands globally. You know, how do each of you see your roles, both as an artist and as a scientist, to tackle this kind of fundamental reality of the sixth extinction?
So first, when I think of it, it is about sharing my passion, because I believe I'm an optimistic person. I believe that we can still change things together. So sharing our knowledge, integrate the public into the society, science and putting science and society together, and increase our working force, so to say. I really think of the way that you love, or you can only protect what you love and have a knowledge about. So I am sitting here. I would love to transfer my knowledge and give a perspective that what kind of solutions are there to rewild, to renaturate. So we have so many solutions already there, but they need to be grasped and shared and put together. So for me, in this project, Berl-Berl, Wissensfluss, and it is the interdisciplinarity that we are putting our strength in art, science, and technology together, and I think it worked out quite well. We were promoting a dialogue. And since we reached out to diverse communities, we honestly, I believe that we will increase our community who, is learning or can learn their whole life, and each of you and us can learn from each other. So I think the inspiration, with inspiration, we can actually tackle all these threats which are posing us at the moment.
Jakob?
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. I mean, as an artist, I think it's for example, this project I think is so interesting because the museum can tackle a lot of those direct educational elements, very explicit and very direct. And because the museum is doing that, as an artist, you can also it's part of the artwork, it's like drawing attention to the sensorium of a wetland, but you can also free yourself in a way and address other ways of sensing, of imagining, of experiencing, and thinking about that landscape that you relate to. And you can do that kind of stronger in that way. So I've been really inspired by this artwork to take that process even further as far as I can, so that a project just like really engulfs people, you know, like brings them in and brings us a curiosity or something, and then they can take that and, for example, connect it to a conservation, a scientific program, or like bring it out that way. So that, I mean, that's how I think about my work. It's also to embrace just bringing a different sensorium, because we're also forgetting just how to sense the world. You know, it's like we sit on screens and all like this all day. So it's like we're also forgetting just how to move and embrace the world around us. So I think that is kind of what I can do as an artist. It's to bring a sense of fascination for that back. But one thing that I do think more and more about is for a project like this, when you digitize it, maybe you can actually do some things of like connecting them to actual land, or like decentralized land or something like this. I'm really starting to think a bit more about, like, because of this project, how can it be even closer linked? So when a scientific group is moving through a landscape and learn about a place or preserve it or something, how can that actually link back into like a virtual artwork to create these kind of direct connections, which I don't have an answer to. It's just, I start to think like this, which I didn't so much before. I thought very separate kind of, but connected. Now I'm starting to think, okay, is there actually a way that there can be a flow sort of between them, which could be an interesting new thing.
New path, next project. I mean, it relates a little what you were saying to my next question. Something that was struck when I was thinking about your work was that, you know, philosopher Bruno Latour, he talks about distinctions, be it such as between nature and culture, which actually helps to seed our climate emergency. And I think you both balance this in a way, like nature in the work that you do, being in the field, Jakob, how you document, Kim, obviously what you do as well, but then also back into kind of a very human organizational culture, you know, Kim working with the archive, Jakob being at a computer, thinking about kind of digital spaces as well, and working in virtual worlds. Do you kind of agree with Latour that it's really that balance or that re-entangling of these worlds that's important for the future?
I mean,
Yes.
exactly. Yeah, absolutely. So for example, like it seems very virtual to make this, but prior to this, you need to like kind of move through the mud and like digitize things with my body for a long period of time. So it changes your vision when you look at a two-dimensional image. And then also like to create an artwork like this after, we also film it in VR. So like you put on a headset and we record it, what you see on screens, by physically moving around those object again, but virtually, so you can kind of look at them in another perspective yet again. So it's actually very corporal. It's very like embodied in that way. So the way I think about all these things is that at the end we are these like ritualistic beings, and to make sense of the world we need kind of like a concept, a story, but it also needs, you know, a collective thing. It needs rhythms, color, movement for us to internalize things. So I think as humans we do this. So even when I go to an archive, that's how I look at it. I think like these scientists spend 10 years looking at birds and things. It's like they walk around and these things have colors and they put them in places and they make stories about them and they go out again, and it's like that's just a very human thing. So that's how I look at it. It's like we have this rhythmic behavior as humans. Like any culture has this. There doesn't exist a culture that doesn't have any ritual dance song thing. It's like it's just universal. I mean, I think. So that's how I think about it. And yeah.
I just agree. Nothing to add here.
Did you say you disagree, or you?
I totally agree.
You don't?
No.
Yeah.
Disagree. I was like,
I'm like, you disagree. Let's get into that.
Yeah.
Agree.
Yeah.
Totally. I can relate to that.
Yeah, absolutely. So Kim, your citizen science projects that you do here with the museum, which really is the public participation in scientific research, is such an important thread to the museum's outreach. And I think it's super interesting personally because it kind of breaks down hierarchies of knowledge, right? It kind of thinks about how can a more general public inform and be informed by and enter into the academy. What citizen science projects have you initiated? What's happening right now? How can people get involved in those?
So when I came here, I really looked it up a bit because we have quite many citizen science projects. First of all, so I think next month we will launch a competence center for citizen science. That means we have not just practical projects, but also on the meta basis, so to say, really looking and evaluating our own doing and try to become better. And one project I actually started with working here is a project case Nightingale, Forschungsfall Nachtigall, which were, or still is, because I think we will go on with that. So is using the song of the nightingale, the biology, and trying to find synergies with the cultural part and the science of it. So we have even gathered not only several thousands of song recordings from Berlin, which people really sent to us, and it's still doing, for example, in 2020, when we couldn't do anything, still 5,000 recordings were entered and sent to us. So it's quite successful. And we have also gathered 500 anecdotes about people and their emotions, stories, histories connecting to the nightingales, all poems and so on. So it's a really diverse project. I think that's also with Wissensfluss and so on, and Berl-Berl. There are several projects that I have to look it up. So micrometeorites, if you like to gather and do some research on the dust of the roof of micrometeorites, or if you like to explore the Bromacker and be a paleontologist, or if you're bees and bytes and you're good in transcription of the thousands of labels which I cannot read, and we have a lot of help. People are enjoying really writing them down. We have bees, pollination, citizen science in Berlin, where they really look at pollination and how gardeners of urban gardens can support or be supported for the conservation of pollinators, which brings me also to a new project which will start as a pollinator pathmaker, where we would also love all the Berliners or German throughout Germany to participate and really collecting valuable data to protect our nature, in this case, pollinators. And so on and so on. I forgot many, I think.
Yeah, there's a lot. Yeah. Thank you both so much. I'd love to open it up now if anyone here in our audience has any questions, either Kim or Jakob.
Why you?
We have a roaming mic. There's one question here.
Thanks for the for the talk. It was really interesting, and the project sounds really good. I was just wondering, can we still see it somewhere, Berl-Berl?
So the exhibition itself at Berghain closed, but yes, you can still experience it through the LAS website called Berl-Berl.world, which is a kind of interactive, here we are on the screen, there we go. You can enter and explore the immersive installation through your phone with a specific kind of navigation tool. Jakob, I don't know if you want to speak to how it appears online as well.
Yeah, so Berl-Berl.world is kind of a beginning as a way of thinking about all the types of collaborations and that go into an artwork like this. So also like two poems, the two poets that wrote their responses to the work. And on the website, you have this Tricklav that is like a navigation tool. And the Tricklav was a center designed for the project. So there was like the natural history archives, but also these stories about a Tricklav, which is a god. That's a mountain, it's a tree, it's like a three-headed being. It's many different things depending on where you look in like a geographical map and in what time in history you look and ask people what is a Tricklav. But it was a god for navigation, for navigating the world from the underworld and through the world. So on the website, you can interact with this Tricklav, and as you do it, you're shifting different perspectives of cameras that are kind of flying through the virtual swamp, and you hear the different songs from the environment. Yeah.
Beautiful. And we hope one day Berl-Berl will re-emerge somewhere in the world as an installation. Any other questions?
Thank you very much for the nice talk and the insights. I have a question for actually both of you. As you both talked about that, yeah, it was very enriching collaboration. I was wondering if you have like similar projects coming up for either the Museum for Naturkunde or for you, Jakob, with another museum?
Yes, I mean, we are working on the next pop-up of Berl-Berl, which I mean, I can't say too much about that right now, but it's gonna be next summer. And then I'm working a lot on these songs. So I'm trying to find more songs from different wetlands across Europe and start working with performers who can kind of enact them virtually in motion capture systems and start doing also performances and also make it more accessible online. So that's what I'm doing now. Yeah.
Yeah, and I just come up certainly with a new. If I'm allowed, is it a yes? Yeah, I mentioned it already. That the museum will continue the collaboration with Light Art Space, and therefore the Pollinator Pathmaker project, which actually just launched this month in Cornwall at the Eden project with the artist Alexander Daisy Ginsberg, will also be brought to Berlin. And I have many ideas already how the concept will be enlarged and enriched with the dynamics of pollination and plants. And for us, I think it is important that in this time we will also focus on like future gardens, how resilient or climate resilient gardens could look like here in Berlin, and open up the dialogue and do also citizen science again here. And I love the idea that it is, I can say that this edition garden which are going to be is like 4 pollinators, certainly you are invited too. And I just loved the idea that connecting nature and having an artwork directly being nature. I'm already inspired and looking forward to the next projects.
Any other final questions? If not, then I would love to thank you both, Jakob, Kim. It's been wonderful collaborating with you both and with LAS to realize Berl-Berl, as well as being able to experience Berl-Berl online through the LAS website. We also have a really beautiful publication that explores much of what we've taught today and so much more that is available actually here at the Museum for Naturkunde, as well as through our partners Koenig Books. So check that out as well. Thank you all. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Yeah.